Sheimos Gittin. I'm imagining that this will be the first of a series, I'm not planning to do all of it at once. Don't worry, and maybe it'll be part of a two-part series or a three-part series. I haven't figured that out yet, but really it could go on forever. It's endless, but I want to focus on specific inyanim, so we'll see how much we can cover. I'm really focusing in terms of the siman of Kov Chav Tes, which is the main siman in Hilchos Gittin that focuses on Sheimos. I'm trying to go, HaEzer, so I focused mostly for today on the first 9 sifim, and there were 34 altogether, but the first 9 are very meaty, and then we can go from there. As with the rest of Hilchos Gittin, the Piskei Tshuva is extremely important, but you have to look at the Piskei Tshuva not only on the siman itself, but also on the Seder HaGet, particularly the Seder HaGet of Yusfish, and not every single volume or version of the Shulchan Aruch which is issued has these Piskei Tshuvas, and they're even more voluminous than the Piskei Tshuvas on the main section of Hilchos Gittin, at least in terms of what's covered there. So it's something which I highly recommend. Now there aren't so many. Mordechai, do you have the printout of the Mar Mekoma? So you don't have it. Okay, all right. So there aren't. So I have an earlier version. So okay, there aren't so many actual sugyos on Sheimos Gittin in Maseches Gittin itself, and in terms of Rashi Tosfos. So let's look at the primary shitos and Yerushalmis Toseftos. So I tried to gather all of the major primary sources, and that was the purpose of the Mar Mekomos, to go through all the tshuvos. So you look at the Yotzei Poskim, there are tens of thousands of tshuvos. I thought it would be useful just to have in front of you, so you can look on your computers or wherever Mordechai distributed it, just the major sugyos and the major Tosafos and the major sources in Tanaitic literature in terms of Toseftas and the like. I didn't reproduce Yerushalmi because Yerushalmis are confusing anyway to you. It depends on where you put the punctuation, whether it's a question mark or an exclamation point, or you can. But right.
Our schools say they solve those problems with their
Oh, okay, right. So I'm saying there are different interpretations, but I'll quote the Yerushalmi as well. Now, establishing Sheimos is a little bit like verifying Jewish status. It's not an exact science. The fundamental principle is that you're supposed to write the Sheimos of the Baal and the Isha in the get, and it's an essential part of what we call the Torah, the major portion of the get. The pashtus is that it's a din d'oraisa, either based upon Sfiras Dvarim of a Bekosab Sefer Krisus, that you need a sefer which is Sfiras Dvarim, who da'asa, as the Gemara says, and the Ramban writes on Daf Chuf Amud Aleph in Maseches Gittin that this is the Reiss source of why we need Sheimos of the Baal and the Isha in the get. Some say that the reason that it's required is because of a cost of la lishma, that you need for the get to be written lishma, and if you don't have the Sheimos of the Baal and the Isha, so then it's not written specifically for the husband and the wife. It's not lishma. That's something which seems to be brought in the name of the Or Zarua and the Hagos Ashri, Milken Perik Besim and Yud Zayin. That is the second approach. Some cite Iran, both in Kiddushin and in Gittin, as learning that you need it to be mochiach, that the idea is that you need it to be mochiach mitoch haget, that the husband is divorcing the wife, and that it's a requirement of muchach mitocho. Difficult to quote because the Yotzei Poskim quotes that based upon the Ram. The truth of the matter is, it's an interpretation of the Ran. The Ran really is saying that the same thing as the Ramban, that it's based on the word because of la sefer krisus, the Sfiras Dvarim hu da'asav, just saying that this is an important part of Sfiras Dvarim, that the Sfiras Dvarim has to tell you the main part of the story. The real requirement of muchak mitocho, as we know from the Sugya and Daf Chuf Da'an base, and Tosfos over there is only according to the sheet of Rabbi Meir, who holds Eidi Chasim Karti. We hold like Rabbi Elazar, strictly speaking, that Eidi Mesira Karti, so we wouldn't require muchak mitocho. There is a shita. Thank you so much. There is a shita of the Mordechai. If you look in Maseches Gittin Siman Shin Nun Daled, the Mordechai says that to actually write the Sheimos of the Baal and the Isha, he says this is a Rishon saying Lulei de Mistapina. It's one thing for us to say, look, he understood the import of his words, that this was quite an astonishing chiddush. but he wanted to introduce, he quotes Rabbeinu Yoel, as introducing the tremendous chiddush that maybe the requirement to actually write Sheimos is only midrabanan altogether, because after all, a person writes a get for a gedola of his wives, and he has two wives who have the same name, so he's not allowed to give it to the ketana, right? But it sounds like he could give it to the gedola, despite the fact that there's nothing clear in the get itself that it's really intended for her, as opposed to the other wife who has exactly the same name. So he says that it must be that Sheimos in the get is really not so earth-shattering altogether. Here's where you have a Yerushalmi in Perek Gimel Halacha Beis does have some language that indicates that as long as the lashon of the get is in the first person, the husband saying, and he's going to deliver the get to his wife, he's saying, I am hereby divorcing you. That's good enough. As long as he says, I am divorcing you. So he doesn't need a modifier after the word I. That's me. Who else is it going to be, right? So like fresh fish sold here, like it's obvious. Therefore, you don't necessarily need to record the name altogether. And the fact that the Gemara says we require the names, and if you're missing the name, it could lead to a get puzzle, and that's certainly how we're asking in Shulchan Aruch. Nonetheless, it is not a it's not a din daraisa, but din darabanan. So that is what I would call an interesting opinion and one to bear in mind. But it's not the mainstream opinion. The mainstream opinion, the assumption is that it's a din daraisa, even if it be din darabanan, it certainly is me'akev. The Mishnah on Daf Pei Amud Aleph says, Shina Shmo Shema results in Teitzim Mizeh Mizeh V'chol Drachim Eiluba. That when you write the Sheimos in the get and you mess up and you write the wrong name, so for sure that's going to lead to a puzzle get, and it's going to lead to the woman's future children being mamzerim. So this is a very, very serious matter. That's why in his introduction to Sheimos Gittin, in his sefer on Dinei Yishus, Rav HaEzer Batzri gives a whole long introduction. He quotes from the Stei Chemet, who quotes the practice that many Rabbanim had, that they would fast on the day of a get because of the tremendous terror that would grip them, that even if you knew all of the halachas of a get, but who says you're going to get the Sheimos right in this particular case? And if you mess up with respect to the Sheimos, so then you could be matam and eshes ishli alma, you could be mamzerim b'Yisrael, chas v'shalom. So it's an extremely, extremely weighty matter. The main reason we don't fast nowadays is because we'll probably do a lousier job if we fast. So we have to make sure that we have all of our wits about us, and therefore, as a general rule, when we want to make sure that we're well prepared for something, we don't rely upon fasting to be sharper. So there maybe the bottom of yesterday were stronger than we were, but it's chalshu adoros. So therefore we need to eat. But nonetheless, don't overeat, right? Don't eat with great confidence. You should still be considering. So one of the most important klolim that actually appears with respect to how we approach the writing of Sheimos in the get does not appear in Siman Kuf Chav Tes. So with respect to the writing of Sheimos of the husband and the wife, but in Siman Kuf Chav Ches, with respect to the writing of the Sheimos of a city, where we say that if you're not sure if a particular river really is shayach, whether it really pertains or is something that furnishes a water supply in a meaningful fashion to a city or not. So then don't write it. Write the river that you know is the one that definitely is associated with the city, and leave out the other one. And then the Ramah, quoting from the Maharik, has a general catch-all piece of advice. He says, V'chein tamid, and this is a rule across the board, Yoiser yesh likones l'safek chisaron mi l'safek shinoi. That it is better, and this is an expression that we quote all the time. It's almost our mantra. When you do a get, probably this is something that you should have emblazoned on the wall of the Beis Din when you do a get, because this is such an important mantra that when in doubt, do without. If you're not sure about a particular name, so then it's better to leave it out altogether. And because as long as you have some sort of a name that you're going to include, as we said, that so if you're not going to have the name of the Baal or the Isha altogether, so then it's literally going to be Ikar Chasam Min HaSefer. So you need to have some name, but if there's an additional name, like you're not sure about a particular nickname, or you're not sure if the Hebrew name of the party was nishtaka or not, whether it hasn't been used in such a long time that maybe it's not considered a name altogether, or you're not sure about how to write a parent's name. What we see in Sif Test that if you leave out a parent's name, the get is still going to be kosher. Or we see, even though it's a bit of a discussion with different shitos that are born in Sif Test, but the bottom line is, and this is the custom, the chatchila in many places, including in many Bati Din in Eretz Yisrael, to leave out the appellation of Kohen or Levi altogether. And you're not sure if the person's a Kohen, you're not sure if the person's a Levi. When in doubt, leave it out and rely upon a get that you know is for sure going to be kosher b'di'evid, because a get that for sure you know is going to be kosher b'di'evid is a lechatchila. Because then you know that you're not going to have to worry about having a apostle a get. If the woman will be free linase, the future children are going to be kesherim. So therefore, we don't take a chance. We'll get to all of this. Okay, so yeah. The problem with again, the problem with the ksuva is that sometimes the names may even be wrong in the ksuva, so you can't rely simply upon names in the ksuva. It could be that if you have a name that a person uses regularly or from time to time, they recognize the name in the ksuva. Sure, that's my name, and that's the name that I use when I'm called up to the Torah, and that's the name that I use when I need to, when we send out our bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah and wedding invitations, and this is the Hebrew name that's used all the time, so maybe then there's much stronger argument that it's not nishtaka. But every single case has to be evaluated. I'm not going into the nitty-gritty right now. Right now I'm giving you the background. It's a very good question, but you have to figure out, sometimes you can rely upon what's written in the ksuva. Everybody would agree that you can't always rely upon what's written in the ksuva. There are mistakes in the ksuva all the time.
I'm not sure about relying what's in the ksuva. If you're doing a HaEzer kiddushin,
yeah.
You do a HaEzer kiddushin, and the family, the chassan is a kohen. Would you put kohen in or leave it out?
Oh, not only would I put in Kohen, if I'm doing a HaEzer Kiddushin, I would put in Kohen if I'm doing a HaEzer Get. I do it all the time. If you're sure that the person is a Kohen. What I'm talking about is the situation where you're not sure, where there's a doubt. If there's a doubt, so then you leave it out. Yeah, that's all I'm saying. And certainly the stakes are much, much higher when it comes to a get than when it comes to a ksuva. If that's what you're getting at, that certainly is the case. So the Mishnah on Daf Pei Zayin Amud Beis tells us kasav chanichasa v'chanichasa kosher. That if you simply wrote a chanicha sounds like a nickname. There are different interpretations. Rashi has an interpretation that this is actually almost like a last name, Shem Lavi Shem Mishpacha Kula, that this is Goldstein, Goldberg, Schwartz, Schneider. This is the name of the family. We generally don't assume like that such a nickname is going to be good enough because many people within the family would share it. But the general interpretation of Chanicha is that it's the person's nickname, and it's a nickname that they're called by everybody. So the version of the Mishnah that we have written in the text in Daf Pei Zayin Mebei says that when the Eidim are signing, so if they write their names and they don't write Eid at the end, so that's going to be kosher. That's what the meticulous people in Yerushalayim would do. And then the next line says, Kasav Chanichasa v'Chanichasa kosher. The next line says, and if you write a nickname, it's going to be kosher. But the Tosfos has the girsa, and many others have the very same girsa. Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Hanan and Rabbeinu Tam is having the girsa is that we switch around that clause, that opening clause of the Nekiah Hadas B'Yerushalayim. It actually is modifying not the way that the Eidim sign on a get, but it's modifying the way that we write a get. The way in which we would write the nicknames of the parties on a get. Just we know that this fellow is called Joey, and the father is called Stephen. Never mind that the official name might be Steve, maybe he's known as Shlomo when he gets called up to the Torah. And this fellow Joey, maybe his name is Yosef Shmuel, and his official Hebrew and his official name on his birth certificate is Joseph. But Lamaisa, everybody calls him Joey, and everybody calls his father Steve. So they hold that's a lechatchila. Chanichasa v'chanichasa kosher, if that's all that was written, you left out all the other names. Maybe there were questions, they were nishtaka, they're not used, etc. V'kach hayu nekiah hadas b'Yerushalayim kosvin, and that is the way in which the nekiah hadas, the scrupulous ones in Yerushalayim, that's what they would do the chatchila. Isn't that a big deal? That's a big chiddush. Shelo hayu kosvin el chanichasam v'chanichas avos. That's all they would write. They would write the chanichos, which means the nicknames, or we call it nicknames. It's not a perfect translation. It's the names that they regularly went by, that everybody knew them by, right? And therefore, it seems from here that this could really be a lechatchila, and you can rely upon it certainly when you're in doubt with respect to any of the other names. And this is something that Bate Din bear in mind very, very regularly. Now, the sugya on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis that talks about Barishona Hayam Mishana Shmo Shema, which is kind of a funny way to start the Mishnah. Mishana doesn't mean that they were trying to write the Gittin in a way in which they would get everything wrong, but it means that they would write the names in the wrong fashion. But Mishana means that you would have people with names in one location and names in a different location, and they would only write the names in the location where they were currently located and not in the other location where they are also known by a different name. Maybe the get would be sent from location number 1 to location number 2, and that would be a problem if the people in location number 2 in the Makom Nesina would see a get that was not consistent with the name that the person was known by in the Makom Nesina. So Rabban Gamliel Azaken made a takana that he said that we're going to write Ish Ploni B'chol Shum Sheyesh Lo, that we're going to write a catch-all. Well, it's a question. Machlokes, we showed him how we even understand what he did, but it sounds v'chol shum sheyesh lo that we're going to add more names. We're not just going to write the first name, but we're going to encompass a generalization to add more names, v'chol shum sheyesh lo, either in a generalized form or specific form. And so too isha plonis v'chol shum sheyesh lo, and so too with respect to the wife, we're going to write not only the name that we know here, but we're going to write all of the names that she's known by, or at least to reference other names, in order to ensure that there not be any kind of a laz, there not be any kind of an aspersion or people thinking that this isn't the get that was really intended for her, or this isn't the get that really came from the other fellow. In the course of the Gemara that comments upon that Mishnah, so the Gemara tells us the story, and this is really one of the main sugyas regarding how we go about figuring out how to write all of the different names, that there was a woman that was known as Miriam, right? Havu Kara la Miriam, they would call her Miriam, Uporta Sarah. And some people call her Sarah. The Girsa of the Rif and others is the Ruba Karola Miriam. Most of the people called her Miriam, Uporta Sarah, and a few people called her Sarah. Ami Nahardais, and Nahardais said this is the way in which you're supposed to write the get. Miriam echol shum sheyeshla, v'lo Sarah echol shum sheyeshla. You start off with the name Miriam. Miriam is the Shem Iker, right? That if the person is known primarily by one name, then you have to write that name as opposed to the name Sarah in this case is not necessarily a chanicha in the classical sense of the Gemara later on Daf Pei Zayin and the Tosas and Daf Pei Ches, because the chanicha is a name that everybody knows the person by. It could be that the name Sarah is a name that not everybody knew the woman by. So therefore, you can't rely only on the Shem Tafel. It's a big question. B'di'evid, if you only wrote, is that going to be puzzle or not? And that's a big machlokes. The Ramah seems to indicate that if you wrote the Shem Tafel, you can get away with it. B'di'evid, Beis Shmuel not so excited about that. So it's a question, the halacha. You have to be very careful. If it's a name that only a few people knows a person as, and you write that name and rely exclusively upon that name, so that becomes a shayla halacha. If you write only Miriam, you write only the person Shem Mikr, and everybody knows that the person has this name, so then that would be okay. Now the truth of the matter is that there are two different ways. There are probably 20 different ways. That's why the Yotzar Poskim is so many pages. But there are two main ways of understanding this sugya with respect to Miriam and Sarah, right? Remember, this is the case, most call her Miriam and a few call her Sarah. And either, and this is something that the Rashba points out, the Rashba has a commentary about this right there on the Daf Lamed Dal and Rebbeis, either that those who knew her as Miriam didn't know her as Sarah altogether. And those, in other words, the majority of people knew her as Miriam, but they didn't know that she's also known as Sarah. The few people who call her Sarah don't necessarily know that she's called Miriam. This comes up because then it becomes important to write both names, because if you leave it out, then a certain part of the population is going to say, this isn't the person, because I know the person Sarah, I don't know the person Miriam. And this is similar to the whole sugya that precedes this Gemara, which is the sugya really that talks about what the Mishnah is referring to, the Mishana Shmo Shema, that we're worried about when a get is being sent from a Makom Kesiva, the place that is written, to the Makom Nesina, the place where it's received, and the people in Makom Nesina don't know about the Makom what the name is in the Makom Kesiva, and the one in Makom Kesiva don't necessarily know what the name is in the Makom Nesina. In which case, it really would be very important to write each name. If you didn't write each name, then you could get into trouble. Or the other possible interpretation is that everybody knew both names. Everybody knew both names. The ones who called her Miriam knew that she's sometimes called Sarah. The one who's called her Sarah knew that most of the time she's called Miriam. So then, says the Rashba, the stakes are much lower. The stakes are much lower in such a case. If everybody knew, so whoever sees whatever name is going to be written there, whether it's Miriam or Sarah, they'll know that she's called by the name. It may be better if it's the name that people know is the main name that she's called. But either name, says the Rashba, would qualify as a Shem Chanicha because it's a name that everybody knows. So Rabbeinu Tam has a discussion about this in the Tosfos over there, and he says that it would only work at B'diavad if we knew both names and you wrote one, so it would work at B'diavad, because l'chatchila you should write all of the names, even if a person is known by both names in one location. Where do we see that? We see that in the sugya on Daf Lamed Hey that talks about a get that came from somewhere. There are a few Gemaras that sort of is as a inadvertently, I wouldn't say inadvertently, but matter-of-factly, mentioned certain Gittin that were looked at that came from various places, and the Gemara just matter-of-factly mentions what name was written on the get. So there was a get that came from Acha Bahidya, the Miskri Ayamori. It doesn't say that the person had different names in different places. In one place, he was known as Acha. He was known as Acha Bahidya, and he was also known as Ayamari. So we see that they seem to have been meticulous to write all of the names that a person was known by. So Rabbeinu Tam says we see that certainly if you know that a person goes by all these different names, so it's appropriate to write all the names that a person goes by. Sometimes you have to figure out what's a threshold. One person knows them by sort of a weird nickname, so that's not going to be sufficient. Sometimes you can't tell if a certain nickname is really used. So one of the questions that gets asked, and this is all based upon this principle that the Rashba is emphasizing, that it's not as bad if everybody knows the names that do appear in the get. So sometimes I'll ask the question that there'll be a person who goes by, his name is Yosef, and he also goes by Yossi, and he also goes by Yossel. Okay, but we're not sure. Maybe he goes by Yossel. He hasn't been called Yossel. There are 3 friends who call him Yossel. He remembers 2 friends called, he spoke to 2 of the friends this past year. He doesn't remember if he spoke to the 3rd friend this past year. Maybe we require at least 3 people who called him the name in order for it to really count. So then I'll ask the question, and you could have various variations of that theme. But one of the questions that I'll ask is, okay, the people who know you as Yossel, do they also know you as Yossi? Do they also know you by the other? And say, yeah, of course they also know me by Yossi. So then it's much easier for me to leave out Yossel because I know that the names that are in there are names that people know that the person is known by those other names. So that's going to be okay. To say that a Chanicha itself is not going to work even b'diavad is really not an accepted opinion. There is a Shiltei Giborim. There's a Shiltei Giborim. Yeah.
Why would you want to leave it out? Wouldn't it make sense that
I would want to leave out any name that doesn't count as a real name, because maybe it's not sufficiently used to count as a real name. That's why I would want to leave it out, because we do have guidelines and we do have threshold requirements for something to count as a real name. That's why I would want to leave something out. Yes. Or maybe the pronunciation isn't clear. Is it this? Is it that? Is it something else?
let's say he says 2 people call him by Yossi.
Yeah.
But maybe there's really 5 people who call him Yossi. You know what I mean? It's like so doesn't make much sense. Want to put I want to be on the safe side. I got everything covered.
So we learn how to press people for correct answers. There are a way of asking questions. If we think that person is saying one thing, but he really means something else, so then we'll ask him further. Generally speaking, a person is believed with respect to what his names are, even with respect to what his father's names are. But if there's some Reiss, there's some suspicion that we have, so then we'll press further, we'll investigate further. But usually people do have nemanis. You have to know part of the art, and when we speak about the art form of being a Masada Gittin, is knowing how to ask questions, and how to elicit information. Of course, the best of our ability. So there is a Shiltei Giborim on Daf at Yud Zayin Mid Beis who does indicate that if you wrote a Chanicha alone, it would passel, and the people are fond of quoting this Shiltei Giborim. Oh, we have to be worried about the Shiltei Giborim if you only wrote the Chanicha. But the truth of the matter is that the Shiltei Giborim is talking about something else entirely. He's talking about a Chanicha, which is a Shem Mishpacha, where all that you wrote was Schwartz or Goldberg. So we understand why that would be possible. So the bottom line is that you can get into much more trouble writing an extra name that is wrong, okay, than writing a Chanicha. The Piskei Tshuva, right off the bat, talks about a fellow. We're not sure if his Hebrew name is Yehuda or Aryeh. We're just not sure. We're not sure that it's maybe talking about a father. It could be Yehuda, it could be Aryeh. We're not able to clarify. But we know that everybody calls this person Leib. We know whatever the real Hebrew name is, Everybody calls the person Leib. That's their nickname that they're called in the street. We're not sure what they would get called if they get called up for an aliyah. But since everybody calls them Leib, so the Piskei Tshuva writes, just write Leib. You can't go wrong just writing Leib. Okay, so that this is the same the same principle. Not only that, but sometimes when you're not sure about Shem Arisa, that whether it's still in use or not in use, like the name that the Hebrew name that a person was given at their bris milah and so forth, so the Chazon Ish notes that if the Shem Arisa, this is the Chazon Ish in Siman Sadi Os Chaf Aleph, the Shem Arisa is Nishtaka, then the Chanicha is the Ikar Shem. There is no other Shem other than the Chanicha. So therefore, you're not necessarily writing something which is inferior or second rate. You might very well be writing the Ikar Shem. We had a fellow once, yeah.
So would it be true a second Jew that never has uses Hebrew names since Bar Mitzvah?
We have people like that. We have people like that, sure.
You transliterate the English name only.
100%. Look, we had a fellow who showed up, a chanicha, whatever the person is called, doesn't matter how peculiar the name is. We had a fellow who showed up, and his friends all knew him as Body Shop. That was his name, Body Shop. Okay, so you're not going to find that necessarily in a normal registry of names that if you're considering how to name your son or your daughter, give him the name Body Shop. We asked him if he's a car mechanic. We couldn't figure out how he got the name, but somehow they gave him the name Body Shop, and that's what we wrote in the get. This fellow's name was Body Shop. I mean, he had another name too. It might have been Robert, known as called Body Shop, but this is a name that you knew everybody called him, so you can, and it's a great way of identifying the individual. There's a sidebar discussion if a person has a nickname which is made up of two different names. There's Body and Shop, but it's not as if Body is a name or Shop is a name. So do you write it with a little space in between? Like, you might write Ben Sion with a little space in between the Ben and the Sion, even though it's one name. So the post can say, yeah, but it's made up of two names. So you have like a little bit of a space. It's not quite the same amount of space you would normally have between two names, but you have like a little bit of space between the two of them. So do you do that? I'm sorry? No, there's no hyphens in a get. So you can have half spaces in a get, but there's no such thing as a hyphen in a get. So there's a question mark as to, let's say a person has a nickname which is known as AJ. Okay, you have that, AJ, EJ, things of that sort, where it stands for actual regular names that the person had. Maybe they were Alan J, whatever, and they're known as AJ. So do you write that with a little space in between as well? So here there's a discussion in there's a little booklet that was put out by Rabbi Gittin Leib Lane a number of years ago, in which he collected, it's called Shar Sheimos Gittin, and he collected the traditions of Talmidim of Moshe Feinstein and the broader Rav in terms of how they wrote different names and what their practices were with respect to Gittin. So he asked that question of those who watched Rav Moshe be beside a Gittin, and they said if he had a name like AJ, he would have like a tiny little space in between. But the brother Rav said, no, it's just what difference does it make where it comes from? The name itself is not said with a pause. It's not like his name, there's a name A and there's a name J, at least a J as just a letter. There's a nickname known as AJ. So since the nickname is known as AJ, so you just write Aleph Yud, Dal Zayin Shin Yud, you write it as one name. And that's our practice. Our practice, because remember, in practice of the Beis Din of America and those who were trained in the Beis Din of America, basically was based upon the broader Rav. The broader Rav was the original Beis Din of the Beis Din of America, of Moshe Levi Steinberg, and whatever practices he had were generally the practices that were adopted for future generations, shall we say, within the Beis Din of America.
You use it on Shivas or B'Tammuz, or Elif wrote in AJ, there's a Chatzi Rebbe in the middle.
He wrote it with a Chatzi Rebbe. It's interesting because it's not what was brought down in the name of the broader Rav. It's not our general practice. Yeah, that's very interesting. Because I don't think it's our general practice.
2 summers ago,
yeah,
we had in the cash advance business, in order to protect oneself, you take on another name. So we had an EJ or something like that, but I don't think we did it too. This is the Chatzi Rebbe in the middle. I don't remember anymore, but it was apparently it's very common that you take on another name for tax purposes.
Okay, well, I'm not aware of the reason, but whatever the reason happens to be. So we wrote Body Shop as one name. Body Shop is one name. Beis Aleph Dal Yud Shin Aleph Pei. Body Shop.
Brother Rav says to as one word. Brother Rav says to one word or two.
The brother Rav says one. He says no spaces. According to the Shar Sheimos Gittin of Gittin Leib Lane, he says just to write it as one word. Now, what about in terms of their practices of deciding when a name is considered to be nishtaka. So this was a question that was posed by Rav Lane, I guess, when he was sending out the questions, and they said both of them had the practice to consider a name to be nishtaka if it wasn't used for 12 months. But the brother of added on, or at least those who learned with the brother of or observed him, added on that it's not exeris hakosuf. It's not exeris hakosuf. I can attest to this, that a Masada has to use his judgment. That sometimes people feel very, very strongly about a name, and even if it wasn't used for, let's say, 2 years, but nonetheless, it's very clear that it's an essential part of their identity, and that it's not wrong. That you're not getting it wrong, and that they would use it whenever it would come up again at a moment's notice. So then you can use it as well. There's a separate question, Eric, that you were asking about whether there is an automatic continuation of a name if this is the Shem Kodesh that a person would use whenever they have a reason to use their Shem Kodesh. A person hasn't gotten an Aliyah in 3 years, but whenever they get an Aliyah, they're making a bar mitzvah of a grandson or something like that. So they normally don't show up in shul, but when they show up in shul and they get called up, they always get called up by this name, and this is the name that was on their ksuva, it's on their bris certificate if they have it, and all of their documents. So there is a basis. There is a basis for that. I think you find in the Chassam Sof and the Divrei Chaim, there are those who talk about it. It's interesting. Rav Moshe has a tshuva on this subject in Chelik Dalet and Siman Kuf Beis of HaEzer, which is much more nuanced about this issue. Fundamentally, he does agree, but he says you have to be careful to see whether this is a real name, whether they just sort of are making up a name over time, whether they originally had 2 names, and then they, in the end, decided they're only going to use one of the names. He says it's not an ironclad rule that because they use it whenever the occasion comes up, that this is really their name. If it was the same exact name as what they started out with, and they're consistent about it, so then it's something that you could rely upon more. But you really have to ask these questions, and certainly we are more circumspect if we see that a person hasn't used the name, and even if it's their Hebrew name and they haven't used it in a couple of years, since we find that people are not always so consistent. That we're afraid that it's not something which really identifies them, shall we say, especially since people do have a tendency nowadays to sometimes change names over time, which is fine. Anybody can change their name, but then it has to be used. It has to be used regularly.
What if a person has like a common name that people call him when he's a teenager in his 20s and now he's in his 40s? Then is that nishtaka?
If he still has friends, if he or she still has friends who call them by that name that was their teenage name, when they were in their 20s and so forth, and in their teens, and they still have their 5 really close friends, and whenever they speak to them, they always call them by that name, so then the name still counts. But more often than not, they're no longer called by that name. When I was younger, I went to law school at one point in time. So in law school, I had to use my legal name. My legal name is Jonathan. For those who are curious, I never use that anymore. But what is what's my Hebrew name? It was Yona. So already at that point in time, everybody called me Yona. But when I registered for my classes, I registered by my legal name, Jonathan. So in law school, people would ask me, what's your name? So I just finally figured out that I would make it easy for everybody. I said, I'm Yona/Jonathan. People said, oh, Yona/Jonathan, good. So then I ended up getting a nickname that all of my law school classmates call me Slash. So that's what they call me. So that was my name. So for a long time, when I was in law school, my name was Slash. But now I don't think that I come across anybody who calls me Slash anymore. Every once in a while, in a blue moon, every 10 years or so, I'll come across an old classmate from law school. Hey, Slash, how are you doing? But it's not really a use. Okay, people are not calling me up, calling me Slash on a regular basis. And a lot of the nicknames that people have when they are much younger. So those are not names that really stick when they get older. Sometimes they do, and if they do, and they're still used by a bunch of people, so then they would still be included in a get. If a person, let's say a woman, sometimes that doesn't use her Hebrew name at all. So what keeps the Hebrew name going? Very often it's the fact that she has a husband or a father who's making Mishaberach for her. Mishaberach, so that we would consider to be good enough in order for the Hebrew name to be still in existence. But what if you have, let's say, a man who gets called up to the Torah regularly, but his father is not a shul goer. His father doesn't use his Hebrew name. But when the man gets called up to the Torah, so he gets called up by his name and his father's name. He gets called up as Chaim ben Gershon. The father hasn't used Gershon in 20 years or whatever it is. but the son is calling himself Chaim ben Gershon. So when we write the get, we write Chaim ben Gershon, or let's say the father really, but to the entire world, he's not known as Gershon, he's known as Gary. So do you write Gershon Amachuna Gary, or do you known as Gary, or do you write just Ben Gary? So our general approach is that we don't want to take a chance. If the father himself is not using his Hebrew name regularly, so it's one thing when you have one person who identifies with the name. The wife shows up, she says, I identify with this name, and the husband says, yeah, I use it for Mishbeach. Fine. However, I don't have the father in front of me. The father is the father may not identify with that particular name. He may not necessarily use that name, or for all we know, let's say we're not able to get in touch with the father. Maybe if he would get called up to the Torah now, he would make up a different name to be called up to the Torah. So therefore, we don't rely upon that in the context of doing a get. The mere fact that the father, that the husband uses this name to be called up to the Torah, there were many cases that the poskim write about, and you find many tshuvas in the Piskei Tshuva. They quote Sinoda B'Yud in particular, and there's an Avodah Sagir Shuni, and there are a number of famous tshuvas. The Get Pashut discusses this at great length. A person got the name of their father wrong. They're called up to they're called up to the Torah by this name all the time. Can they be maksik a name for their father, even though it's not their father's name, because everybody knows them as having a father by this name, but it turns out the father doesn't really have this name. It's a big question mark in the poskim, and many say that it's possible, many say that it's possible even b'di'evid, so therefore it's better not to take any chances. There is a Tosfos on Daf Peyam and Beis, which is the centerpiece of this particular discussion, and that is with respect to a HaEzer. They used to write the city where the husband was born and where the wife was born as a way of identifying them. This is not something that we really have the wherewithal of doing nowadays, and the Gemara talks about the Mishnah on Daf Peyam and Aleph says Shina Shmo Shema Shem Yirav Shem Yirav Teitzim Mizeh Mizeh. Right, that if you made a mistake in the husband's name, the wife's name, or in the city's name, or his city's name, her city's name, so then the get is going to be completely invalid. So Tosfos quotes Rabbeinu Yitzchak. He says, Omer Rabbeinu Yitzchak Tainu Daki Yeshidarim Ba. That's only the city in which they lived. But if you're writing the city not where they're living right now, but you're writing the city in which and we don't do that anymore. We don't even write the city in which they're living. We write Ha'omer Yom Omer Asayom. Omer Yom Omer Asayom could be that they drove 3 hours from, they drove an hour and a half from South Bend to Chicago, or an hour and a half from Milwaukee to Chicago, and they're doing the get in Chicago. They're all made in Chicago. They don't live in Chicago, right? So we don't write the city in which they live. But
we live in a very mobile society. People have moved around all the time.
okay, but even if we didn't, that's part of the picture. It's too risky. But if you would write the city where they live, and it turns out you write a city where they don't live, so you're 100% correct, then the get is going to be invalid, like the Mishnah says, so it's going to be very risky. But Tosfos says, if you write something that really is not going to be clearly indicative of a problem, like the city where they were born, who's going to know where a person was born? Do you know where I was born? Do I know where you were born? I have no idea. I know you all very well, or some of you, but I don't know necessarily where you were born. So he says about Shinolad, if you're going to write the city in which they were born, which apparently was the practice at that point, afilu shina kosher, even if you got it wrong, it's going to be kosher. Why? Kevin Shein Sarch Lakoso Klasha, Kamonim Shirgilu Lakoso, Mishum Shem Yishem Yosef and Shimon Achir, Yebo Simonai de Malcolm. Later, they just came up with like a simon, but so you don't really have to write it all together. And he says very often you'll write the place where the person was born based on the husband's say so. And why would we rely upon the husband say so if it's something that's going to passel the get? Some say that, so you see that anything we rely upon the husband say so, we shouldn't passel the get. But it's not true. Certain things like the husband himself and his father himself, we have to write. But this we wouldn't necessarily have to write. So if we're going to be relying upon the husband say so, it must be that it's not something which is going to passel the get. And then the very end, where the Tosfos continues along these lines, he says, this is 4 lines from the bottom, source 13, there was the case where they got the Makam Leida wrong, and the Reiss said it's okay because nobody really knows the difference anyway. And of course, we always have the suffix chisomen is better than a suffix shinoi, so if they didn't know, he said better leave it out altogether. While we're on the subject, he says you don't really have to write the Makam Amida either, because who really necessarily knows where a person is standing when they're writing the get or receiving the get and so forth. Whenever we send the get from Chicago to California or to Israel, we don't write Haomedes Hayom. We don't write the woman is standing here because you know what? She ain't standing here. She's in California. She's in Israel. So give her the Benes Hayom. So obviously these things are not me'akev. We do a nechbaz. A nechbaz. A husband is in a rush, or he only agrees to give a get if he can be in the bezdin for 15 minutes and then run away. So we quickly have him authorize the get, then he leaves, and we write the get. When we write the get, he's not even there anymore. So we can't even write Homed Hayom. In that case, we don't have Homed Hayom. We don't have Homedes Hayom. So clearly, this is not something which is me'akev. Okay, he says the pshita dein tzarich lichto makom amidaso. So he says that we don't even talk about this case at all because it's obvious that you don't have to write the makom amidaso. So some say, so you don't have to write it. So then that should also fall into Rabbeinu Yitzchak's general category that if you got it wrong, which is kind of hard to get it wrong because you just, when you're going to write a get, you kind of know the place in which you're writing the get, so you're probably going to get that right. But if you got that wrong, it really should not passel the get. So some wanted to say that since we paskin and sif test that, it's not necessary to write the name of the fathers of the husband and of the wife. That's just something that we add as an additional siman, and we have a number of gemaras that indicate that this is something that was done regularly, but it's not me'akev. You don't absolutely have to do it. So if you messed up the name of the parent, this Bala Iter says like this, so it's not going to be me'akev. But the Noda B'Yehuda doesn't go for that in a big way, and most of the poskim don't go for that in a big way. They say, no, that really is part of the name itself. You see that you know the person, and you know that their father's name is X, and then in the get it wrote that the person's name was Y, so then it's clear that the authorization of this individual gave the get was a different authorization. Either was trying to mess up his wife by not really giving her a get, or was a different person altogether, as opposed to just when the sofer is writing the place where the person was standing. So maybe the sofer got it wrong, but it's not the actual tzivoy of the Baal itself. It's not the identification of the person itself. So therefore, this is going to be much, much worse. Some I distinguish, Piskei Tshuva quotes in the Get Pashut, who distinguishes based between the Abi Ha'isha and the Abi Ha'Baal, that maybe the Abi Ha'isha, a woman is known as being married to her husband. She's not generally known by her father's name. Even in the Mishnah Berurah, you're not going to mention the father's name, you're going to mention the mother's name, right? The wife and the mother's name. So therefore, maybe that's less consequential. Even that is a very, very serious shaila. So therefore, we have a question with respect to father's names. Better to leave out any questions, any names that are questionable, and to just include a name which is Chanicha Shakol Kohen Bo, a name that you know that everybody calls this individual. Or if you don't know the name, you can leave out the name of the father altogether. B'didi haba uvda. So I had the following case for myself. Okay, so here's another story. I started signing Gittin. This is when I started working in the Bezdin world about 28 years ago. And I was at that time, point in time, Rabbi Michael Broyd was the director, so he was the 1 year interim director of the Bezdin of America, and he was instructing me to get my feet wet in terms of being involved with the writing of Gittin, and I was being involved in Gittin in general and so forth. So I signed a few Gittin, and as an aide, and I learned how to do the whole drill and so forth. It was very, very nice. I learned some Safras as well. Oh, Hashem, I have a long name. I have a lot of letters that I had to learn how to write properly, so it was very good. I was able to put to practice what I learned with Rabbi Schneid when I took his class in Safras, when I was in the Smicha program. And then I just happened to mention in passing that there was like a little bit of a hullabaloo regarding my father's Hebrew name that came up when my older sister got married. When my older sister got married, so she was marrying a fellow named Tzvi Shlomo, and my father's name was Tzvi. And there was like a little bit of a discomfiture, tzvi, and all these different these different rules of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, and so people were a little bit squeamish about the whole thing. And then they got the bright idea that maybe you didn't have to necessarily just write Tzvi, and even though he's Tzvi, my father's name, was Allah Vashal, my father was Tzvi. From when I was a young child, and I remember my father getting Elias the Torah, so I was always called up Tzvi, Tzvi, Tzvi. His whole life it was Tzvi. My whole life, my father got Elias a lot because we're Kohanim, so he got Elias all the time, Mamish all the time. It was just Baruch Hashem. But it turned out that when he got married, his name wasn't Tzvi. On my father's ksuva, it says Eliyahu Hirsch. That was his name. My father's given the name Eliyahu Hirsch. He was born Harry E. Reiss. The E was for Eliu, Eliyahu. It stood for Eliu in English, and his Hebrew name was Eliyahu Hirsch. His name was Eliyahu Hirsch. So I don't know, it was Eliyahu Hirsch. But over time, we were always friends. When he was younger, you talk about what people were called as a nickname by their friends. My father was in his teens. Nobody called him Eliyahu. His English name was Harry. but people called him Hirsch. All of his friends called him Hirsch. He was Hirsch, Hirsch, Hirsch. So at a certain point in time, he dropped the Elio. I don't know when he dropped the Elio. Maybe by the time he got married, he was hardly using the Elio, but whoever was Masada the Kiddushin figured, okay, that's the official name he was given, so I'm going to write Elio Hirsch. But he was Hirsch. He was Hirsch. So then I had a bris milah. On the bris in those days, when you had a bris milah, you also came a little certificate, and my parents kept a little, baby book, whatever. So it has all the things in the baby book. So in the baby book, it has the bris certificate. My father's name was listed as Hirsch. I was Yona Yitzchak Yaakov and Hirsch HaKohen. That was my name, in the official bris certificate. So at that point, it went Hirsch. But at some point in time, the Hirsch became a Tzvi. Because he kind of, figured the Hirsch is just a Hebrew, a Yiddish version of the Hebrew name Tzvi. My father was a very proud religious Zionist and all of those things, and believed in, the Hebrew language using Hebrew names. So somebody gave him the idea. I think I even know who it was from the community. And said, hey, why don't we go Hirsch? You get called to go in proper Hebrew name, call yourself Tzvi. So my father started to go by Tzvi. This all happened before I even knew what was flying. By the time I was 6, 7 years old, going to show with my father, he's getting called up. It was always Tzvi, Tzvi, Tzvi. Tzvi ben Ephraim HaKohen, Tzvi ben Ephraim HaKohen. That was always my father's name. Always, always, always. But since my older sister was getting married and there was this little bit of nervousness, so they worked out, whoever was Masada Kiddushin, we're going to write Eliyahu Hirsch, and we'll put Tzvi in parentheses. I said, what are you doing? You're taking my name. First of all, I sign Ksubos all the time, and I called up to the Torah like twice a week. I'm a Kohen. I get called up all the time. What are you taking away my name? I was annoyed by the whole thing. Okay, but it's okay. I got over it. I love everybody in my family. They're all wonderful. Please, everybody's great. But the whole thing was, just like a little bit of a nuisance, from my perspective. So I happened to mention to Rabbi Boyd at the time, it's kind of an interesting evolution with respect to my father's name. He started as Eliyahu Hirsch, and became Hirsch, and became Tzvi. And, it was my whole life. He was always Tzvi. But I'm sorry, but I wanted to make sure. He said, I'm signing a get. We know, very, very serious thing. You have to be so concerned that you're talking about Ishisish, being Matra Ishisish over here. I just want to make sure it's not a problem. So he said, ooh, this is such an interesting shaila. It goes the whole question about the father's names, and if you're Meshana father's name, I think you should ask a shaila Rizam Nechem Yegober. I think you should ask a shaila Rizam Nechem Yegober regarding this entire issue. So that made me super nervous. I was super nervous. What have I done, and so forth. It was so annoying, but I did, all the research on the different shitas. I quoted everything from the Get Pashut and whatever about Meshana father. How a person has the right to change their own name, and how my father really did change his name, and it wasn't his fault if at one point somebody decided to write a ksuba alluding to his old name, but he never changed anything. He continued to get called up to the Torah as Tzvi, and it was always Tzvi, Tzvi, Tzvi. That was always his name. So I wrote a very, very long, handwritten. I didn't have a computer or anything in those days, and I didn't have a Hebrew typewriter, so I wrote a handwritten, tried to write it very neatly, very handwritten, long tshuva. I got his fax number. In those days, we had something called a fax, and I sent over this fax, and it just so happened that I was home. I have no idea why. Usually I was out in the middle of the day, either in the yeshiva or in the Bezdin, whatever it was. It happened that I was in my apartment in the middle of the day, and the telephone rings, and it's Razam Nechem Goldberg. He picks up the phone. He says, it was very nice that he read this whole missive that I sent him and everything, and he felt that I was so concerned about the Gittin that I was signing, and are they good, are they not good? I was so nervous, my goodness. So he felt he needed to reassure me. So he called me up, and he said, don't worry. It's not a big deal. He said, everything's fine. All the Gittin that you signed, perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. So I was thinking to myself, okay, Baruch Hashem, but what about the future? I have a lot of, first of all, I sign a lot of ksuvas, Baruch Hashem. And secondly, I had a lot of friends, who would ask me to be an ksuva. And secondly, I needed to know, is it okay for me to continue to sign Gittin? The Ramah writes in Siman Kof Lamed, Sif Yud Aleph, V'chol Davar Sheyesh Bo, this is with respect to the Chasimos of Edom, who sign on the get. V'chol Davar Sheyesh Bo, Tzas Sofek Ketzad Kosvo, Ein Roi L'chatchila L'chosmo, Ki Ein L'kanes L'sfeikos, L'chatchila Below Tzorech. Whenever there's any kind of a question mark regarding an aid, and how he should sign his name, so we stay away from trouble and we have the person not sign his name. So I said, should I sign him? Stay away, because my father's name wasn't originally Tzvi. Is that going to be a problem? So he said, no, you can sign even the Chatchila. I'm guessing he said that because every person has the right to be Meshana his name. My father had Meshana his name for years and years. He used the name Tzvi like 2-3 times a week. He was constantly getting called up to the Torah. So I felt so much better. because I had been so nervous. I was like sweating for like the entire period of time. It was Nechemia, obviously. He saw this young fellow, who's writing an earnest, tshuva with him, always Mara Mekomas, and who's so nervous about this. So it was very kind of him that he took it upon himself not to like put it on the back burner, but mamish to call me in the middle of whatever his busy schedule was. So then Rabbi Boyd, of course, told me that he knew the answer would be yes. But he wanted me he wanted to train me in terms of writing up my learning and the sugyas and so forth. Okay, so Rabbi Boyd was a very good mentor, by the way. He's a very good mentor. So, but the whole ordeal was a petrifying experience. What are you talking about? Tzvi, of course. Of course, Tzvi ben Ephraim. Going, yeah. Not even. It's not even a shaila. I never had the slightest shaila. I mean, me saying I have the slightest shaila, but I got nervous when Rabbi Boyd told me I had to write a shaila. It wasn't really a shaila. It wasn't really a shaila. Yeah. He encouraged me to contact his own. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so we have a case right now in Chicago of a man who was a proud Kohen, proud Kohen. Okay, for many years, and then he got divorced from his wife. And when he divorced her, so of course everybody knew him in town. He's a Kohen. He said not only is he a Kohen, he's a proud Kohen. He's been a Kohen his entire life. We all know, but now he's divorced. Not so easy to find women to date. So he decided, it's hard to be a Kohen. Hard to be a Kohen in these circumstances. So it turns out he realized, his father wasn't so from, his grandfather wasn't so from, and he found a well-known posek, who was able to tell him on that basis that you didn't really come from stock. You can't rely upon a tradition of a Kohen. You're not a Kohen. Don't worry, you're not a Kohen. So this way you can marry grushos, because that makes life a lot easier to be able to marry divorced women in the community and so forth. So the Rav of Shul told him, wait a second, if you're not a Kohen, so then your get is puzzle. So you can't date the grushos because you're not really divorced, because your get is puzzle. So the Rav of Shul called me up to confirm whether I would agree with that. He said, I'm sure you wrote the Kohen in the get, so wouldn't it turn out that the get is puzzle now that he got this psak that he's not a Kohen? So even if it's true, Lu say that's true, that he's not a Kohen, so then he needs another get. So I said that I did not think the get was puzzle. Why is that? Because I was convinced that he was a Kohen. But I don't go with this. His whole life he was a Kohen, and he was Cheskas Kohen. He's a proud Kohen, getting called up to the Torah all the time, and championing the fact that he has Kedushas Kahuna and so forth. So the person only decides that they have a problem with their Kahuna when they're looking to date. So I've never been impressed by that. But it seems that he had a psak that it was relying upon. So this was an issue. So one of the local shadchanim asked him about whether he was going to give his wife another get. One of the shadchanim thought of this issue. He said, well, now that it turns out you're not a Kohen, are you going to have to give your wife another get? So he said, no. He was told that the get was kosher. The get, even though he's no longer a Kohen, and the get said that he's a Kohen, nonetheless the get is kosher, because at the time that he gave the get, he was a Kohen. That was his explanation. The time he gave the get, it was a Kohen. Works perfectly, right? So this is a question. This is a very, very serious shaila. Maybe there is such an argument, but certainly on a lechatchila level, I think it's a very, very difficult argument. The Piskei Tshuva in the Seder again is a long sifkatan, which is sifkatan chav daled, and he talks about this. He quotes from the Sefer Mayim Chayim. Piskei Tshuva has two major svarim that he quotes a lot in brackets in Hilchos Gittin. One is the Ksam Sofer, because the later volumes of the Tshuva's Ksam Sofer got published after the original version of the Piskei Tshuva got published. But there was another Sefer that also got published after the initial version of the Piskei Tshuva got published, and that's the Mayim Chayim. Mayim Chayim was of Chaim HaKohen, Rappaport, who lived approximately exactly during the same years as the Ksam Sofer. He was a Rav in Austria, lived approximately the same time, so it's not surprising that their tshuvas should come out around the same time. They should both be in the bracketed part of the Piskei Tshuva. So what happened? What's the case that was discussed by the Mayim Chayim? Mayim Chayim discusses a case where a man came to a town near his kehillah, and he was mechazik himself as far as Kriyas HaTorah is concerned, as far as Ksuvas is concerned, as far as Shtaros were concerned, as Yitzchak Meir ben Avram Alevi. Yitzchak Meir ben Avram Alevi. His whole life he was known as Yitzchak Meir ben Avram Alevi. He gave a get to his wife with that name, and the Mayim Chayim makes sure to point out, and the Piskei Tshuva quotes this, like this is an important part of the equation. They made a chayim that nobody can be motzilaz in the get. Of course, we always make a chayim that nobody should be motzilaz in the get. And then 2 years later, he sent a message that when he returned to his hometown, Berdichev, he discovered that he wasn't really a Levi after all. This is Lishma for sure. right? Because here it's not a question of he needs to marry, date a grusha, right? You could do anything, even if you're a Levi, you could do anything, right? Okay, so he discovered that he wasn't a Levi, and the local Bezdin confirmed this. The local Bezdin did the investigation, and they confirmed this. But in the meantime, the woman who had received the get from him, where it said HaLevi, where it said Yitzchak Meir ben Avram HaLevi, she had already remarried. So what's the story? She's an Ashish Ish. What's going on over here? So he quoted the Noda Yehuda, who said that if you write Kohen or Levi, and it turns out that it wasn't true, so then the get is going to be is puzzle, even b'di'evid. Now it's true. The Noda Yehuda has two tshuvas on this. In one tshuva he says that this is my feeling. But if the husband dies, because it's supposed to be a get to release the woman from chalitza, if he ends up dying, so od chazon l'moed, so he seemed to be indicating that maybe he would reconsider. But then in a later tshuva, when somebody was like quoting that back to him, he said, I only said that because of the kavod amore, because the person who wrote me the shaila was a rav, and he wanted to paskin the other way, and I wanted to show kavod to him that it was something that required careful consideration. But I didn't really mean it. I meant that it's 100% the puzzle, b'di'evid, and there's nothing to talk about. And the Yosef Poskim has a little bit of a literature about those who say, no, he really didn't mean it the first time, and then the second time he was claiming he didn't mean it. Okay, we know of such things. We know of such things. But either way, that's what the Noda Yehuda Paskin. However, even if you assume, says the Maim Chaim, that the Noda Yehuda meant it, and that it's going to be puzzle b'di'evid. He says that that case, he said, was different because the person wasn't the father about whom it was written that he was a Kohen or Levi, wasn't mechazik himself as a Kohen or Levi. The child made a mistake, like the daughter made a mistake, the son made a mistake, they made a mistake. They thought that the father was say a Levi, and they got it wrong. So even the Noda Yehuda would agree in this case where the person had a chazaka their entire life that they was known as Levi, and at the time that the get was written, it said it was just relying upon the chazaka that the person was known as a Levi, that in such a case, imnises lo say that if she's already married, then she doesn't have to leave her husband, and not only does she not have to leave her husband, but even if this original husband is willing to knock on her door and say, guess what? Out of the kindness of my heart, I'm going to give you another get. So you don't have to be living with this Boel anymore. She doesn't have to accept the get. She could say, get out of here. I'm already divorced. The first get was kosher, at least b'di'evid. I don't want to see you ever again. Don't darken my doorstep anymore. But the difference is, in that particular tshuva, the woman was already remarried. So it would seem to me that if the woman hasn't been remarried yet, even according to the kul of the Mayim Chaim, if a person was mechazik himself his entire life as a Kohen, and he gave the get as a Kohen, and now let's say it would really turn out. Let's say we would accept the opinion that the person is really not a Kohen in terms of allowing this individual to date a grusha. See, even according to the Mayim Chaim, she's not nises yet, that the wife is still single at this point in time. The get wasn't given that long ago, that probably would be appropriate to give another get. That's what I would think. I'm not paskening, I'm just raising the case that we're dealing with right now. So these are halacha l'maisa issues, very much halacha l'maisa issues, and you have to figure it out. But Mendel and Ravik in his sefer Atzei B'Samim says that when you're dealing with the non-firm who are not practicing, this individual, maybe his father was informed, his grandfather was informed, he's a practicing Orthodox Jew, regularly goes to shul and so forth. But he says that when you're dealing with the non-firm and they show up and they say, oh yeah, I'm a Kohen, I'm a Levi, he says you can never trust them because of the fact that we hold that b'di'evid is going to be kosher if you don't write Kohen, you don't write Levi. In certain places, Rav Eser Batzri says he never wrote Kohen and Levi ever. In his Bez in Yerushalayim, says they don't do it. Their practice is they just don't write Kohen and Levi altogether. So he says that he learns that he's learned over the years, you can't trust what they say. One person thought he was a Kohen because his grandfather's name was Aaron. He says, his father's name was Aaron, he must be a Kohen. Another woman assumed that she was a Bas Kohen because of the fact that her mother's father was the Rav HaEzer. If he was the Rav HaEzer where he was in Europe, so therefore he must have been a Kohen. And that's the mother's father. So therefore she assumed that, I must be a Bas Kohen. So he says they don't have any frame of reference whatsoever.
What if one person comes with a photograph of the kever with the hands spread
Okay, you're not usually showing up with the photographs of the kever, and that's the whole separate issue of whether you can rely upon the kever altogether. The whole chuvas of Rav Moshe, and there's a whole literature of that with Rav Shlomo Amar and Rav Asher Weiss, and a bunch of chuvas about that issue. It's a separate issue. Certainly, if somebody claims they're a Kohen or Levi, and I look at the ksuva. Let's say they're from the conservative community, and even the ksuva doesn't bear them out. It doesn't say Kohen or Levi, so then I'm not taking any chances. Sometimes you have a person who really speaks the shpach, like they know exactly what it means to be a Kohen or Levi. Yeah, I wash the hands of the Kohanim every single yontiv, and even though they're like traditional conservative or something like that, but the ksuva bears them out. Their recollections of what they do bears them out, and so forth. So then I think there might be some more room to be made in those cases. But otherwise, you don't. You have to be very, very circumspect about these things.
Yeah,
Now, yes.
We had a nice gentleman sitting here and wants to convert. His mother's not Jewish. His father's last name is Cohen, and his last name is Cohen. And he tells everyone his last name is Cohen. You also have to ask you a challah or a goy.
Right. So nowadays it's not the most unusual thing that you have people who mamish have extremely Jewish names and they just aren't Jewish altogether. Just like a person can have what they call the Kohen DNA, assuming that there is such a thing. It wouldn't prove anything, even assuming that it would be reliable, that it would show the patrilineal line in terms of the DNA. It could be that the father at some point in time married the grandfather, great-grandfather married a non-Jewish woman. And the person is not Jewish. Forget that they're not a Kohen. They're not Jewish altogether. Yeah. Now another very important rule, which is mentioned in a number of places, but certainly it's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. In Siman Kov Chav Tes, you find in the Olei Shem very strongly in Klal Aleph Os Beis, is to refrain from writing to Gittin. You should always try to avoid. Sometimes you could say, we're not sure. The person's a Kohen, not a Kohen. Why don't you just write to Gittin? Because there might not be proper das when the husband gives over either get. And when it is done, in those very rare circumstances, I've been involved in maybe 2 cases where we felt that based on the doubts, a second get should be given over, and even then it probably was not strictly necessary to do so. But then you have to make sure that the main time that we do it is with a get cherish, because a get cherish, we're not sure whether it should be written as a ma'aseh bezdin or whether it should be written as a document, as a regular get, with the cherish basically speaking directly to his wife, the way that a normal get is written. So therefore, there we have no choice, because it's a big machlokes, whether it's written in lashon bezdin or whether it's written in lashon baal. But even there, there's an important rule, and that rule is whenever you do 2 gittin, the husband can't know there's going to be a second get. When he does the first get, he has to think this is going to be the only get. You only tell him that it's a problem if he's a Talmid Chacham and a Cherish. But you have to tell him only after the first get is finished do you tell him that we decided we're going to do a second get. This comes up, by the way, if you do a get zikoi. When we do a get zikoi, because we determine you have a woman who's unlikely to accept the get, but she's already married to another man, or she converted to another religion, in which case we have grounds to do a get zikoi for somebody else to accept the get on her behalf. There's an unmitigated zuchus in her benefit. So it's important in those that after we do that, since we hold that we're afraid that this is not going to be sufficient, think based on the Rif, that this is not going to be sufficient to enable her to remarry, and it's only going to be good enough in order to enable the husband to remarry, that we still need to appoint a shliach to deliver the get to the wife. So then after we have the shliach serve as a shliach l'kabbalah, basically, who hasn't been appointed by the wife to accept the get. So then we're going to appoint him to be a shliach l'holacha to give the get to the wife. So we don't tell the husband when he's dropping the hands in the get in the hands of the shliach, who's then serving as the shliach l'kabbalah yedei zikoi in the first place, that afterwards we're going to have you take the get again and give it to the same shliach as a shliach l'holacha, because he might not have the requisite kavanah the first time around. So that's another instance where this comes up. And you have to also be discreet. I've learned when you misader this type of thing, to not necessarily tell everybody in the room what you're going to do, unless you can trust that everybody is going to be discreet, because people have a way of plopping more than they should sometimes. Oh, you're going to give over a second one after this, right? It's like, no, don't say that so loudly. So you have to be, it's the same problem when you have 2 gets. And we had a case recently. We received the get to deliver, ayidei shliach, and when we looked at the get, we saw that there was a slight negius a slight touching of two letters in the chasimus of one of the edim. It was such a slight touching, it wouldn't invalidate anything. But we figured that liyeser seis, we should scratch off the area in which the two letters were touching, but we didn't want to take any chances in terms of creating more problems, so we didn't want to do that until the get as it was, since b'di'evid it was fine the way it was, would first be given over to the wife, and then we would scratch off a little bit and give it over again. So we did that, but we had to make sure that the husband, as he was giving over the shliach when he was, we didn't even want the shliach to know. So he didn't even tell the shliach when he was giving over the get the first time that we're going to have you do it a second time. So these are some of the issues that come up. To Gittin is a very, very complicated thing, and generally speaking, we try to avoid it. So there's a tshuva that the Ramah quotes. This is where it comes up in the context of Cohen and Levi, because the Ramah quotes the tshuva of the Mari Mintz. That the Mari Mintz says, if you're not sure if the person is a Cohen, although you're not sure whether he's a Cohen or not, so give two Gittin. One Gittin will say Kohen, one Gittin will say, well, will not say Kohen. Give the one that you know is kosher first. That's what will be the one that says he's not a Kohen, and give the one that says that he's a Kohen a second. So the question is, the Piskei Tshuva asked the question, how could it be that we're going to require two Gittin? It's going to be kosher for sure if you give over the get that says that he's not a Kohen, and we should rely upon that l'chatchila. Why do you have to have a second get that says he's a Kohen? When in doubt, do without. So he quotes in the Get Mekusha, says it's a typo in the Ramah, and it's not whether it wasn't a case where they weren't sure whether he's a Kohen Olo, the way that we have it in our version, but rather it was the word shouldn't be Olo, but rather we have in our Imyesh Safek Imhu Kohen Olo. So there's a little in this version of the Shulchan Aruch, there's a little footnote in front of the word lo, and if you look in that footnote, which is number 8 over here. It says, or probably says, if I could find where it says the number 8, but what the Get Mekusha says is instead of lo, it should say Levi, that you aren't sure whether the person's a Kohen or a Levi. So therefore, if you're going to give the get that says neither, so you know for sure that it's wrong, because you know that the person is either a Kohen or a Levi. So in that case, you really have no choice but to give two different Gittin. But the tractor, I see here he has the 8. Ayem Piskei Tshuva Shuto Sofer B'Tzarach Lomar Levi. Yes, okay, very good. And the Piskei Tshuva says, no, the whole thing, whether it's Kohen or lo, or whether it's Kohen or Levi, it doesn't really make a difference, because according to our general practice that we don't like to give over to Gittin, either way, even if I know the person's a Kohen or Levi, I still don't have to write Kohen or Levi. I could still give over one get that says nothing, right? And the Mahari Mintz was the Shitaso, because the Mahari Mintz did not have a problem in other contexts with writing two Gittin. He didn't subscribe to this principle that was articulated by others, that you should avoid at all costs writing two Gittin, and therefore our own approach would be that we would just generally avoid, even under those circumstances, writing two Gittin. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, they have a practice that if there was a Shem Arisa with one name, let's say a person was known as Abba Moshe, and now the person goes by, I don't know, some other name, by a different name. Let's say they go by Mutal, or they go by Moshe, or only Abraham, but they don't use the full name of Abraham Moshe. But we know that when they started out, they had the full name, Eliyahu Hirsch, whatever it is. They had the full name. So when they write the person's name now, which is different from their original name, or maybe only a portion of their original name, so they will write Demiskeri at the very beginning of the name. They will write, let's say the person started as Avram Moshe, they dropped the name Avram at one point in time, and now for 30 years they only go by Moshe, they write Shtaros Moshe, they're called up as Kohen, they're called up for whether Kohen, Levi, or Yisrael, they're called up for Elias as Moshe, there's no Avraham whatsoever, but since they started as Avram Moshe, they'll write the Miskri. They'll write the Miskri, even if the original name is Nishtaka. So this is an odd thing, because we write the Miskri if we're saying the person is Avram Moshe, and they're also called Avram, so Avram Moshe, the Miskri Avram. But we don't start a name with the Miskri, because when think of the person who's talking, it's the husband who's talking, he's giving the get, he says, Ana, I, the Miskri Avram. Who calls himself the Miskri Avram? There's a person say, I, the one known as Avram, Maybe the author of Moby Dick, call me Yishmael, but that's only like a literary flourish where most people don't talk it that way in terms of how they're describing themselves. So our practice is that we don't write the mystery at the beginning of the name. And we had a fellow whose name had been Levi Yitzchak, very common name, obviously, Levi Yitzchak from the Babish community. His name had been Levi Yitzchak, or in the Hasidic community, but he doesn't get Elias anymore. He doesn't get Elias anymore, but he's still not an individual who has broken ties with his Jewish roots. So everybody calls him Levi. He just doesn't go to shul. And he hadn't used the name Levi Yitzchak in a few years. And therefore, since our general approach is that if the full name is not in use for a period of time, we consider it to be nishtaka. So, okay, at one point in time he's Levi Yitzchak, but he decided that now he's Levi. So therefore, we wrote in the get Levi. Because it would call, why? Because we know it's kosher. How do I know it's kosher? If everybody calls him Levi, so that's what we call Chanicha Shakol Kohen Bo. That's Rabbeinu Tam. That's that's the Mishnah on Daf Pei Zayin Beis. Chanicha. That's the first sif in the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Kov Chaptes. The Chanicha Shakol Kohen Bo is 100% fine, 100% good. So then I got contacted a couple of years later by Asher Aaron, my good friend, in Eretz Yisrael, who takes care of a lot of the Gittin cases that have to deal with Chutz La'aretz and the like. And one of the Rabbanim in Eretz Yisrael came across this fellow. He made Aliyah, and he's going through his paperwork and so forth. He says he has a get. He says, "What is this? This fellow's name is Levi Yitzchak, and you wrote Levi." So even if he doesn't use Levi Yitzchak, why didn't he write the Miskri Levi? Why didn't he use the Miskri Levi? He started as Levi Yitzchak. You should have at least written the Miskri Levi. So he wanted an answer for me why we didn't write at least the Miskri Levi. So I wrote back to Rav Aaron Troy and I said, that this is our practice, that our Bati did. We never do such a thing. And I said that there are a couple of explanations for this. One is that Rav Moshe Feinstein held, and this is brought by Rav Lane in his Sefer, that it's a chisaron in a Sfiras Dvarim. It's a chisaron to write Sfiras Dvarim it's a chisaron of Sfiras Dvarim to write the Miskri at the very beginning of a name because it's not the way that people normally talk. Sfiras Dvarim means it has to be a Sfiras Dvarim the way that people normally talk. Since this is not the way people normally talk, it will be a chisaron Sfiras Dvarim. Number two, in the event that the original name really was nishtaka, that it no longer exists for our purposes, if you're going to follow that possibility at least, so then it would be sheker, because the Miskri suggests that there really is another shame. It's just that we don't really know fully how to reference it or how to spell it, or we're not sure whether it's Aryeh, whether it's Yehuda. Even the Piskei Teshuvos case, when he said to write the person's name as Leib, he didn't say write it as the Miskri Leib, he just said write it as Leib. So it's the same idea over here. Some want to distinguish between something that's obviously a nickname, something that's not obviously a nickname, but in the Osva Posky, he points out that that's not glat. That's whether it's a name or whether it's a nickname, if it's a name that whether it's a standalone name or a nickname, or it's a name that everybody calls the person, so you could treat that as a chanicha, and that would be 100% kosher. So I wrote my letter. I didn't get any further responses, so I assumed that my letter was considered to be sufficient.
The actual
Yes.
Maharit didn't say that. Our actual Maharit was
Yeah.
about if you have a suffix, if there is another name. You had no suffix at all. You had a suffix nishtaka. That's the modern version of the Maharit that everybody tries to pull. That's the suffix nishtaka. Let's pull the Maharit out of our pocket and use it also. Of course, someone's going to mention that in the page of the Shulchan.
Yeah.
It's a new thing.
Suffix nishtaka.
Yeah.
Okay.
Apply the Maharit to suffix nishtaka. When there's a vaday name, and that you had, and it's just nishtaka, then we can pull out that Maharit. That's a new thing.
Mm-hmm.
The page of Shulchan Aruch was going to mention that.
Mm-hmm.
That was only by the HaEzer national case.
We have to deal with the new situations. We have to deal with it.
Like, there's no taina on, it wasn't the example in the Piskei Shuvah, because that wasn't something we ever thought of at that time.
No, of course, you're not going to cover all these things. We have many new scenarios nowadays that didn't occur. We have the scenario of a woman who's the question is her Hebrew name considered to be nishtaka when it's not used at all, and the only time it's used is when she's older l'Torah, when she gets an aliyah. So is that going to be that? That's not. I can guarantee you, it's not discussed in the Piskei Teshuvah. You don't have these types of shilos in the olden days, but we deal with that. Yeah.
Tafsis was never aimed.
Yeah.
In the times of the early Achronim, was never aimed at a suffix nishtaka. It was always aimed at a suffix shem. I never knew that there was a name in the first place. I'm not sure. The guy's name was Joey. It was probably Yosef, but I don't know. I have no record of it. As opposed to I know it was Yosef. He never uses it anymore. He just goes by Joey.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's so surprising surprising that Aaron Troy would.
No, Rav Aaron Troy, no, it's not surprising. Rav Aaron Troy was just passing along a message. It was fine. I don't think. Yeah.
Can't see beyond his four amos. So there's a Moshe Feinstein
Yeah.
out there who says we don't do this.
No. Look, Rav HaEzer Batzri alludes in his sefer to a correspondence I think that he had with Rav Moshe on this particular issue. What's it, Shari Ezra? In the Shari Ezra, he has this communication because Rav Basri was very, very adamant about doing this way. Apparently, Rav Moshe was very reluctant about it. He says, in the end, the get was delivered, so it was all good. But clearly, he knew that Rav Moshe had difficulty with this. Rav Basri writes very clearly, of course, this is what we do. This is the right thing to do, and so forth. But Lamaisa, Rav Moshe felt this is not the right thing to do, so it's not what we do over here. It's not what we do. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Not a chutzpah, no. This is Darka Shel Torah. This is beautiful. It's the Agda Torah. I have no tinus whatsoever. So I'll tell you another story. Now, the next story is, no, it was a valid question. Our practice is also, like Rabbeinu Tam, that we don't write B'chol Shum. Now, here's another thing. Rav HaEzer Batzri in his sefer writes B'chol Shum. Of course, the whole world writes B'chol Shum. There's a muta bate din somewhere in the world. I think I heard that don't write B'chol Shum, but no, of course, this is the practice that you write the names, and there were three minhagim. It was minhag Sfard, which is to write the name, the main name. That's what it sounds like, in the Sugya of the Gemara. But Miriam B'chol Shum Sheishla. You write the main name, and then you write B'chol Shum and all the other names that the person might have, and so forth. Write the words of B'chol Shum, and then you had minhag Ashkenaz. Minhag Ashkenaz actually was to write all the names, Miriam, the Miskaya, Sarah, and only afterwards, V'chol Shum Sheyesh Lo, Asaya, and so forth, or Yesh Li, or Asri, or Asi, with the Shonas of V'chol Shum. And then there's Minhag Poland. So that already sounds like we're getting degraded status. Yeah, Minhag Poland, whatever. So Minhag Poland is like what we do. That we write all of the names, and we don't write V'chol Shum. So you look at that, Minhag Poland is basically Rabbeinu Tam. It's basically Rabbeinu Tam. So that's our practice, and that's the practice which is advocated by the Ramah. So during the time of Corona, we sent a get to France, and the Rav there, the Masada get in Marseille, was scandalized that we didn't write B'chol Shum. How could we said the Sheimos to him, and he never saw such a thing before. I get that doesn't have B'chol Shum, that we're just writing the names. So I explained to him that it is, our practice has a very authentic origins, goes all the way back to Rabbeinu Tam, goes back to the Ramah, and the Aruch HaShulchan says that it even creates a problem b'di'evid, for us that we shouldn't deliver such a get, because our practice is that we only write B'chol Shum in the event that we're dealing with a Meshumad. Because in the Meshumad, you don't want to use the name that the Meshumad received when he converted to Catholicism, when he apostatized. Because the minhag used to be, when they would apostatize, they would get a special name. They would get a special name, whatever it is, Christopher, Nicholas. They would get a special name at that point in time, and you weren't supposed to write in the get. So the Ramah talks about it. So you write B'chol Shum only in that circumstance, but otherwise you don't write. You're not supposed to write B'chol Shum altogether, and it's like a Reiss within the get. But what would be the taina? So the taina could potentially be that but we have this whole sugya and Daf Lamed Dalet and Beis, that when a person has a shame in the Makom Ksiva and the shame in the Makom Nesina, so you're supposed to write the shame in the Makom Nesina where the get is going to be given as the Iker, and that somehow is translated into the fact that you are supposed to follow the minhagim of the Makom Nesina. So here, the Beis Shmuel, one of the very first Beis Shmuels in Siman Kov Chav Tes, talks about what if you're sending a get from a place which writes B'chol Shum to a place that doesn't write B'chol Shum. So he says that, l'chatchila, I guess you should write it. Im yodim mizeh yesh lichtov l'chatchila k'mo shenogim b'makom shenosnim. V'im lo yodim, but if you didn't know, v'chasru v'chol shum near the kosher. He says that I think that it would be kosher under those circumstances, and therefore you can rely upon the b'makom ego and Armova poskim who say that you would write v'chol shum if you sent from a place that writes v'chol shum to a place that didn't write it, and the first place, and the Makom Ksiva wrote v'chol shum. But then he writes ulehipuch. But let's say it's the opposite way around. Let's say it's my case, where it's a bezdin that doesn't write v'chol shum, that's sending to a place that does write v'chol shum. So says the Beis Shmuel, then it's not even a suffix. It's not even a question. What do you mean? They should thank their lucky stars. He doesn't use that lashon, but that's what he says. They should thank their lucky stars that they're so fortunate to receive such a get. That's what he says. Well, the Hibruk ein chashash. Im b'makam aksiva portim kol Sheimos. That's wonderful. Makam aksiva, they actually wrote all of the Sheimos. Makam nesina kosim v'chol shum. Makam nesina, this is one of those places, where they rely upon v'chol shum. V'nichtav aget b'makam aksiva as the kulei kosher. That for sure, 100% kosher. Imports in b'makom shekosrim b'chol shum. Vein lachash mishum laz. Gittin rishonim. You have to worry about any laz. Whatever. Everybody knows this is coming from a really good American bezdin, right? The nishlach mimakom aki yadua shekastu al piyam minhagim. Oh, wonderful. They were poet called Sheimos. Nothing to worry about. Whatever. So I sent this over. I said, of course, we were dealing with the mashumad. Okay, then we could talk about b'chol shum. But otherwise, this get should be 100% glap. But he was surprised. I also pointed out something else to him. I said, if you would have said to me, when we sent you the get, how am I supposed to know what the practice of this particular bezdin is? Okay, nobody talks about minhag safat, right? How am I supposed to know that in this particular place they write? If you want me to write b'chol shum, to tell me. I've had requests for us from Bati Din and Eretz Yisrael. Please send us a Sfarish get. We want a Sfarish get. We want you to write the whole thing nusach Sfarad, which is a very, very big demand upon us. That's a tall order, because we don't necessarily have experience doing that. It's a dangerous thing to write a nusach that you're not accustomed to. Even v'chol shum, you don't write the same way, the words v'chol shum. You don't write the pronouns the same way for a get, for a woman and her shemos, for a get that's being delivered ayidei shliach, than for a get that's being delivered directly. So if I would just look in my manual, if I had to write b'chol shum and I do it in the normal way, it wouldn't be done properly when I'm sending it. So it was one bezdin in Eretz Yisrael that asked us to write b'chol shum for them, and I really looked very carefully into it, and we did it very meticulously, and then they sent a thank you letter. Oh, we really did go. We couldn't imagine you would get it right, and we're so excited that you got it right. But why did they ask me to do it in the first place? So I don't think it's a good idea if you're coming from a bezdin that doesn't normally write b'chol shum to ask them to write b'chol shum, to ask us to write the Sheimos a particular way. That's fine, but to write all of the Lashonas and Nusach of Sfarish get, probably not a good idea altogether. However, I said to him, had you asked me, okay, that's a different story. You didn't ask me to begin with. And there's nothing, that would be problematic in terms of sending over to the Makom Nesina. Now, to what degree, since this appears to be such a big deal when it comes to the giving preference to the Makom Nesina, why is it? And I asked the question for those who are involved with Gittin. Why is it this doesn't really seem to be on anybody's radar? I mean, it's a major sugya. It's a very convoluted and confusing sugya. Exactly how you what passos and what's good lechatchila and what's good b'di'evet and what's good imnisei sloteitze and what's when we say baneha mamzerim in all these different scenarios. If the makom nesina knew that there was another name makom ksiva, but they didn't know what the name was, and makom ksiva knew there was a name makom nesina, they didn't know what the name was, so they knew what the name was. There were many different variations and many different interpretations of the sugya and so forth. So the question is, why is it this doesn't seem to come up so much? So I think that one of the reasons why it doesn't come up so much is because of the fact that nowadays we generally know all of the names that a person goes by, regardless of where they are. There isn't as much ignorance and as much oblivion between people who live in far away remote locations, because we have the internet, we have WhatsApp, we have mail, we have email, we have the telephone. And the Rashba writes that when there is a knowledge in both places, Makom Ksiva, Makom Nesina, of all of the different Shemos, so then it doesn't become as earth-shattering if you leave something out, as long as whatever name you use happens to be like the same thing as if both names would be, the get would be given in the place where both of them are standing, and it's both the Makom Ksiva and Makom Nesina. In the case of like Miriam and Sarah, we says that if everyone knew both names, like we said at the beginning, and you only wrote one of them, so it's going to be okay. So it really doesn't come up so much. The Otzra Poskim also quotes another Svara from the various Poskim who say that nowadays that the get doesn't get circulated around as much, so that the get is kept in the domain of the Bezdin, and the Bezdin makes a tear in the get and then keeps it, so nobody's going to look at the get. So we don't worry about makom laz as much as, in the olden days. Somebody's going to look at the get and they're going to say, oh, how come it doesn't have the name that I knew the person as in the makom nesina? So that's my guess as to why these things are not focused upon as much. How has this whole halacha of makom nesina being the ikr, like what the Gemara indicates? First, you write the makom nesina, and then, at least according to our Gemara, Rabbeinu Tam quotes the Tosefta that says the makom ksiva is written first, but we assume the makom nesina is the ikr, and then you only write the makom ksiva after the makom nesina, because after all, the get is being given over in the makom nesina. So you write the name the person is known as the makom nesina, and then you would write the name the person is known as the makom ksiva afterwards, or the b'chol shum in the case if he didn't know exactly what the name was, he just knew that there was a name, which is probably the most difficult and problematic case. But the way in which it has morphed over the years, and it's kind of funny because this was never said explicitly by anybody. Like nobody said, oh, nowadays this is how we're going to apply the halacha. Like there wasn't like an official conference that was held, an official declaration or proclamation of these sources. I'm just telling you, as somebody involved in the get world, what I've noticed. This is kind of like the way it's evolved. So the way it's evolved is that when there is a get to be delivered in a different location, so the Rabbanim of the first location turn to the Rabbanim in the Makom Nesina and they say, you take the Sheimos in the Makom Nesina. Since the wife is in the Makom Nesina, presumably you know better than we do what her names are, which of course only makes sense if in fact she's been there for a while, not if she just happens to be passing there because she's on vacation, in which case it really should be the Rabbanim of the Makom Kasiba who should establish her names as well. But assuming that she actually has more of a presence in a domain over there, so you know her name's better than us, we'll take the names of the husband here because, again, the assumption is when the husband's in the Makom Ksiva, he really is in the Makom Ksiva, and there you have the best insight as to what his name's on. He doesn't really have another name in the Makom Nesina because he's not there altogether. And the way that it plays out is just by giving that courtesy and giving that authority to the Rabbanim in the Makom Nesina to make that determination. So that's really the way that it plays out nowadays, as far as I can tell. Okay, now I'm sorry?